Imagine what these kids in this example are modeling to their children about what'll happen if some horrible tragedy happens to them and their kids say, hey, we don't owe you anything. Sue me. Not a great model to show your kids if you want to live a long and healthy life, according to Exodus.
Nope. Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Yo, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with my lovely daughter, Sydney Grace Pryor, who's back from South Korea. How you doing,
Yes,
Sid?
I'm doing good. I'm glad to be back.
How was your time?
Amazing. I don't regret it at all. I'm very satisfied with the experience I had. Got done when I wanted to get done, and I'm really glad to be back.
Nice. Well, we're really glad to have you back. It was a long 3 months, and everyone on the podcast has been I'm sure, just like, where is Sydney? I know we did get to do one, I think, from South Korea, but
Yes.
yeah, Sydney's my most faithful conversation partner in the family. It's amazing to get to finally get back to these conversations. I'm going to enjoy having you back.
Yeah.
All right. I got a couple clips I want to play for you and just process with you. We'll see if we get through both of them. But all right, this first one is from our friend Dave Ramsey. So Sydney, are you familiar with Dave Ramsey?
I've heard him. Yeah, I've heard of him.
Okay. Yeah, he's very famous in the Christian world, especially because of his advice about all things money related. And he's got a show, and he's got his daughter on a show. So I thought me and my daughter could watch Dave Ramsey and his daughter talk about, I think that's his daughter who's going to be on this clip, about this question: Do our kids really not owe us anything for raising them? And Sydney, you're allowed to say whatever you want about this topic. All right. Just
Okay.
your dad, if you agree with Dave Ramsey, you can say it. If you disagree, I love this topic though, so I thought we should hear this because they really like get into it in this. So there's a lot of Q&As. I think that's what this is. So let me cue this up, and then I'm excited to get your thoughts on this.
Start budgeting for free today.
All right, today's question comes from Robert in Texas. My wife and I put our children through college, bought them cars, and provided for them till they moved out. To this day, we still pay their phone bills, despite the fact that our oldest child is a doctor and our youngest is a manager for a high-end retail company. Both earn six-figure salaries. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we were hit with two natural disasters last year, a flash flood and a fire to our home. We didn't have flood insurance, but were able to cash flow the repairs for the flood and our deductible for the fire. We currently only have 3 debts, 2 vehicles, which replaced the ones that we lost in the flood, and our mortgage is $47,000. Even though our children earn 4 to 5 times what we make, they say, according to your teachings, in parentheses, they have no obligation to help us. They have told us, well, Dad, Dave Ramsey says to allow you to sink or swim because your debt is your obligation. Are we wrong to ask them for help, or are they interpreting your advice incorrectly?
I think that might be it. I'll definitely get his reaction here. But Sid, what say you? What do you think of the situation?
I mean, I'm not very familiar with what David Ramsey teaches, but I assume by him saying that your debt is your responsibility?
Your obligation.
Your obligation. I assume he means by you like signing up for something that is going to put you in debt. And that's completely different from experiencing some kind of natural disaster that you had no control over. So that's kind of crazy to equate those things, but also, especially for very financially stable children, to not help out their parents at all is simply ridiculous. Like, that sounds so insane to me, so ungrateful and stingy, like not generous. That's my initial reaction. I'm like, that's kind of insane to not be grateful at all for what your parents have provided for you, because apparently they did like create the means for them to obtain such a nice and cushy job that will provide them with these 6 figures. So that's kind of insane to not be grateful at all, not to share any of their reward with their parents who are in need. So that's wild.
I hear you, Sydney Grace. But look, we live in this one generation culture, right? Where the bonds and connections between the generations are severed. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. And yeah, so we gotta let's take a minute and listen to their response and their conversation around this, and then I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Wow. Okay.
It doesn't sound like I mean,
First thing is, it's weird when you pay your grown kids bills of any kind, including their phone bill. And you know whose fault that is, Robert? Yours. You should have cut that off when they left home. I don't pay Rachel's dadgum phone bill. I don't pay her Netflix bill.
Denise
don't pay
does
her
have
gas
y'all's
bill.
Netflix password, though.
What?
Wait, do I pay your dadgum phone bill, Sydney?
I don't. Yes, you do.
Okay, I'm just curious. Okay.
Well, I didn't give
That's
it to her.
besides the point.
That's not the point. So that's thing one. Thing two, Robert, when you raise children, and as part of raising them, you buy them a car and pay for their college, and when they leave college and they become successful adults, that does not obligate them. They're not in debt to you. That was like your job.
They are not in debt to you. That is
Mhm.
your job. Ooh, remember that one.
You're the dad. That's what you're supposed to do. Well, I changed your diaper, so you need to send me to France on a vacation. What? I've heard this crap my whole life. I do not understand it. Okay. Your children are not obligated to any of you because you did your job as a mother or a father. They are not in debt to you because you fed them. Period. So the entitlement that is dripping through this, Robert,
Okay. All right, let's get into this. So there's a huge misunderstanding that he is propagating here in this teaching. And so the Bible actually has a very, very clear stance on this topic. Do children owe their parents? And the answer, according to the Bible, is absolutely yes, both in the Old and New Testament. And part of the reason why this is so confusing is that there's a collision between West and East in the way that Dave Ramsey is sort of framing this. All right. So he's framing this in incredibly black and white terms in terms of like debt obligations. Right. And so the West has what's called a guilt, sort of justice guilt culture. And the East, they have a shame honor culture. And the Bible was very much written in a shame honor culture lens. And the gospel, even, it's addressing the shame that's created in a shame honor culture. And I think a lot of what happened through the gospel as we came out of the shame of a shame honor culture, it really almost created this justice guilt culture that we have today. So that's kind of sort of complex sociology, but I think it's actually playing deeply into his reactions here, because our culture does not understand honor, and honor it is a kind of debt, but it isn't the kind of debt that shows up in a extremely black and white balance sheet. And that's, I think, where this is getting confusing. I think Dave Ramsey lives in an extremely concrete world in which it's all of these lines are very, very bright and clear. And in an honor culture, it is not super clear. So that's one, I think, part of what's creating the confusion here. Now, the reason why I think the Bible specifically lays this out is in the Ten Commandments. It says very clearly, honor your father and mother. And that word honor was understood both in the Old Testament and then is reiterated in the New Testament, specifically around providing for your parents in their old age. And so that's why Jesus was confronted in the Gospels by the brothers who came in and said to him, what's going on here with honor? Like there was a conflict. There was another story where Jesus was confronted because there was a family that there were children who were not giving their parents money because they gave it all to the church. In their day and age, it was honored into the temple, right? So essentially, they said, look, we're going to dedicate all of these earnings instead of giving their parents, and Jesus actually confronts that. So you have a fine way of setting aside the word of God for the traditions of man, right? This was one of the ways that he actually confronted the Pharisees. And because of course they benefit from when children do this, in this manner. So that I don't think there's any I've never heard any controversy around this, and that the Bible clearly teaches that honoring your father and mother is not just being nice to them. Like, we think about that in those terms again because we separate anything financial because that's so concrete. We can't think about honor in that way. We think about honor as, basically don't say mean things about them, or occasionally maybe say nice things about them. That is not at all what this is talking about. It's in the Ten Commandments because there's a certain connection between the generations. And then in the New Testament, you have even a clearer example of this. And in one of the most concrete passages in the Bible is really about how the generations are to together and treat one another. It comes from 1 Timothy 5, and this is, we're given, an even more clear. Let me pull this up real quick and just read this passage. So I'm looking at 1 Timothy 5, where it talks about widows, and it's describing what, and this is where we get kind of that famous passage. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially the members of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so this is a really critical element of what it means to actually be a part of God's kingdom, is to provide for your family. But it's also talking about parents, and that's primarily the context of this entire passage, right? It talks about widows, and if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. It's interesting, this phrase, some return to their parents. There's lots of ways that this is translated. Let me read this in a couple of the translations. It basically has the same nuance, but I think it's really helpful to see this. New Living Translation: if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents for taking care of them. Repay their parents. That sounds like there's maybe an obligation. So this is to me is so strange that this is like so obvious to Christians today, that there is no connection or obligation between the generations, that the obligation only goes one direction. It only goes from parents to children. Now that's where I think that's primarily where the obligation goes. Paul even says this, in one of his epistles. He says something like, it's really the duty of parents to provide for their children, not children for their parents. That is the normal way it should flow. Like, wise parents should be constantly thinking about how to make sure that their children are cared for. But there are situations, and so there's a disaster that's occurred in 1 Timothy 5, right? You have a widow, and in the case that there's a widow in the home or in the family, then this creates an obligation for the children to care for their widowed mother, right? So we know that in certain circumstances, and this was the insurance policy of every family, that if you, because as you're getting older, there was no Social Security, there was no government assistance for aging parents. Aging parents were primarily trying to provide for their children, care for their children. But if a disaster strikes, and in this family, they're describing two disasters back to back, right? A flood and a fire. And if this actually happened, then wow, it does seem like there's an obligation there. So yeah, Sydney, what are your thoughts?
It just makes me scared to think of a society where there is absolutely no crossover with the generations, because, I mean, when you think about it, that is what family is. It is generations crossing over each other to enrich each other's lives and help each other out and always be there for each other. And it's just ridiculous to draw the generational lines where you're saying the help can only come one way. Like,
Right.
we are the only ones benefiting in this situation. So don't be so, what was the word? Entitled to ask for anything in return. That is just like very unbiblical. I feel like that is a concept that was started and birthed in the West with no consideration of biblical principles and family principles. And it makes a lot of sense in the West. I'm sure this is a message that is very widely accepted in the West, of just they're doing their job as parents and they should not be obligated to expect anything in return. And in a society that, like the one that we have, I do understand where they're coming from, but it's just not what the Bible describes. It's not the world that God wanted for us to have. And I do understand that there's like so many things that don't fit with God's image anymore, doesn't fit with God's vision anymore. but that doesn't mean we can't strive for that. And we are called to be striving for that as Christians. And so the fact that Mr. Ramsey is advocating for the direct opposite is surprising, because it does make me wonder how rooted in the Bible his beliefs on this subject are, because it feels very clear that the Bible is saying that family has obligations to each other. The parents have obligations to their children, and then when the children get older and their parents become less able, then it is the responsibility of the children to help the parents. And that makes a lot of sense. There I can see there's so much harmony in that, that agreement, that arrangement. And I think that that is just a beautiful way to live life, and to think that children are just supposed to be consumers and only take and take and take, even when parents have been so generous. Like, I know that some parents don't even provide for their children's education or cars or anything like that. I know that a lot of parents decide that children should do that themselves for just a responsibility. And so the fact that these parents in particular have been so generous to provide absolutely everything, including their phone bill, even when they have set careers in place, and for the children to be so offended and not give anything to their parents who have experienced this tragedy, these two disasters that have, like, upended some part of their lives, I'm sure. And so that is just ridiculous to me. The only people that could help the parents in that situation is the government. And that is why we have seen so much of the government stepping in to fulfill family
Right.
roles that have failed. And I don't see that as a win at all.
No.
Like,
No.
I see that as a failure on our parts individually. And whenever we see the government needing to come in place of a daughter, a father, a son, a mother, like grandparents, like, if they have to come in to fulfill the role of any family member, that is a failure. And that should not be something that is expected. That shouldn't be something that is a sign of a good society. I feel that a sign of a good society is the government not needing to step in so much, because we have our stuff together. We work together. We help each other out so much and so well, and with so much love, that we don't need the government to come in and have to give us so much aid all the time. And we can see this in different, like, subsects of society in our American society. The places where the government is stepping in the most is places where family is the worst, is crumbling the most. So we can see that as a trend just in society, and I don't see why we should be running towards that trend. I don't see why we should be supporting the division of the family so much. And I even left a comment once on a video that was talking about this, that everyone was in so much agreement that whenever parents ask something from their children, it is such entitlement.
Right.
And I'm gobsmacked that so many people think this. And they think it's because the parents did ask to have them as children,
Right.
but the children did not ask to have them as parents. And that is ridiculous. That it is true that the children had no say in what family they were born into, but it is true that whatever parents they got, whatever children these parents received, they took care of and they provided for 18 plus years. And to think that they will receive nothing in return, even when
Right.
they are in need. And all
Yes.
parents are going to get old and die someday, and they're going to need so much care when they get to that point. That is a guarantee if they don't die young. So to think that they should just be going into these government facilities for care instead of these able-bodied younger children that they've had that are now older and able to take care of their parents, that is just ridiculous, to not think that out of the kindness of their hearts, out of gratefulness, out of gratitude to their parents for raising them for 18 plus years, it is just ludicrous to think that they wouldn't be there wouldn't be any obligation whatsoever to take
Right.
care of them.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
That's a perfect example, Sydney, when you say the parents chose to have the child. Therefore, the child has zero obligation. That is a perfect example of a justice guilt culture. So what a justice culture does is it tries to find sort of first layer principles for where the obligation actually comes from. And this is, I think, the way Dave Ramsey thinks. He's incredibly logical and concise about where's the grounding of the justice in this situation. And so, and it is true. Like if you were just trying to ask the justice question, right? I mean, an example of this is, if somebody were to, and Jesus kind of tells this parable of like, there was a man who owed somebody, $1 million. He runs to the master, and the master frees him of the debt completely. $1 million, completely forgiven. The next day, he goes to some guy who owes him $1,000 and is about to throw him in prison. Now, from a justice perspective, nothing's been violated at all. Like, it was the decision of the king or the master to forgive the $1 million. And so from that perspective, okay, well, that was your choice. Now this guy, he's choosing not to forgive this guy $1,000. There's no connection from a justice perspective between these two stories. And this is where the justice thing just breaks down so spectacularly, because then of course you have Jesus saying, the story ends with, of course, that master coming back after that guy for not paying forward what he had received. And this is an intuition that's created within an honor culture that is missing in our context, because we are 100% justice and 0% honor. This is the weirdness that's created. So you could pour out, for example, onto your children just every blessing you can imagine. You could sacrifice your entire life in all kinds of ways and for your children. And all of that sacrifice over 20, 25, 30 years, however long it goes on, does not, from a justice perspective, mean that they owe you. Like there's no balance sheet somewhere that says, okay, you're now you owe your parents $1 million. No, there's no balance sheet anywhere. From a pure justice perspective, you're not going to find that obligation. It's not going to hit any books. But from an honor perspective, they've accumulated so much in all of this that to not pay that forward to your children, or to pay that back in ways that you might get to, in some small way, show gratitude towards your parents. Like in an honor culture, everyone sees that there is an obligation there. That is not, again, it's not a matter of justice. You're not going to be able to go to a court somewhere and haul your parents, or the parents haul their children and say, look, I spent $1 million raising my daughter, and she won't give me $1,000, of her money when I'm destitute. Like no court of justice is going to say, oh, you owe your mom $1,000. In fact, maybe you owe her, much, much more than that. No, there is no justice. There is no justice system that's going to enforce that. That is a matter of honor. And you do owe her a debt of honor, and that honor should be repaid back in money if what is required in order for you to demonstrate your love for what, and the gratitude for what you've done, is some amount of money. Now, there's no defining that. And this is what's so confusing. And this is what Dave Ramsey wants to do. This is what a justice culture wants to always try to figure out. What exactly is the debt? Because Dave Ramsey is so obsessed with debt that he actually sees almost the world through that lens. And I think that's a huge mistake. That is a component or a category that exists and should exist in transactional relationships between me and a bank. Like that's all that matters, is the debt. Between me and my son, me and my daughter and me, no. Like that's not primarily a question of debt from a black and white perspective. It's primarily an issue of honor. And we need, if we're ever going to see multi-generational families come back into existence, we have to learn to understand this issue of honor. Because part of what people are saying, and I've heard people say this, I don't want to have kids because of exactly this conversation. They're like, I'm going to pour my life into them, and then they're just going to fly away, and there's going to be zero obligation to the relationship, zero gratitude for everything I've done for them. I treated my parents that way. I expect my kids to treat me that way, so I don't want to have kids. I think this is actually one of the hidden reasons for the plummeting birth rate, because everywhere in the West where we lose connection with an understanding of honor, we lose an understanding of how multi-generational families work. There is then no benefits that are going between the generations, because we don't, from a justice perspective, see that it's necessary. And so these kids can sit back, with their huge paychecks and all the things that their parents have done for them, and feel zero obligation to demonstrate honor through any kind of way of supporting their parents in a way that would be material. Man, this is such a disaster.
It is
Yeah.
just so rooted in the gospel to have the mindset of the honor and shame culture, especially in cases like this, because I'm thinking of stories of people that I feel like embody the gospel well. Like I'm thinking of Les Mis, that man, Jean Valjean, that would have been arrested, but then was forgiven, and then he paid it forward to other people and became such an amazing man. People like that and stories like that, I'm just like, that is so the gospel. That is beautiful. We didn't deserve the debt that got repaid for us. And now the one thing that Jesus is asking of us is to show other people that love and to pay it forward. And it is so crazy that Christians would not agree with that perspective, especially with people that should be so easy to show gratitude for, these people that have poured into you your whole life. I can't think of people that I'm more grateful to than you and mom. And it just seems so crazy to not believe that and to not carry that out when you're a Christian. And you should have these same beliefs that are so rooted in the Bible. You can't pick up a Bible without coming across these beliefs and this mindset. So it's crazy to think that we don't owe anything to the people that have
Right.
raised us.
Yeah. I think that this creates some strange intuitions. Like I'll give you an example of one of the weird things that happens when you start believing in 100% justice, 0% honor. So we have family members who, for example, do not like to receive gifts, because as soon as they get a gift, they're like, okay, they feel like they have to calculate. Okay, that was $20. Now now you've actually cursed me by giving me this gift, because now I feel like I owe you a $20 gift. It's like, no, 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 no. Like, again, that's assuming every single relationship is transactional, and as opposed to honor. And so what you want to do is first feel the connection that you have with that person. Wow, thank you so much for this. You don't owe them anything from a monetary perspective, but you're going to
Mhm.
feel the desire to honor them in return. And that
Yeah.
the fact that you've created that sense of honor between you, the fact that they might have started that process by giving you a gift, that's a beautiful thing to do in a relationship that then creates a bond. But if you only see this through the lens of debt obligations, again, justice and guilt, then your primary experience of receiving that gift is the feeling of guilt, because now you've incurred an actual monetizable, definable debt that now you must discharge. And so this hyper transactional way of viewing familial relationships is just a disaster. I one of the tweets that I put out sometimes that I love getting conversation around is something I learned from this thinker Nassim Taleb, and he wrote something similar to this. I kind of reframed it. The size of the group determines which political framework is optimal. With my family, I'm a communist. With my community, I'm a socialist. With my city, I'm a Democrat. With my state, I'm a Republican. With my country, I'm a libertarian. And with the world, I'm an anarchist. So this one of the things this is not necessarily from the perspective of governing, but from the perspective of economics. I'm
Mm.
primarily thinking about this through. So if you think about each size of group, I think communism, in terms of like this idea, each according to their ability gives to each according to their need, right? It's a beautiful idea in a family, right? So if you have somebody with special needs in your family, and you're going to say, look, everyone needs to make the same. No, that's ridiculous. You're communist with regards to your family. Like, if somebody in your family is really struggling or suffering, you want to say, I from each according to their ability to each according to their need. That's a great thing to do in a family. And one of the biggest problems in communism is the accumulation of entitlement that just dissolves people's motivation to work. Now, you can deal with that very easily within the context of a very small community like a family. Like, you ought to stop giving to your son. If he's refusing to work, then you stop giving him food and a place to stay. Like, but you can see that he's like playing video games in the basement. And so part of what you do in a communist system that is that tiny is you start withdrawing and say, well, what you actually need is not a place to stay. And what you actually need is not money. What you need is the motivation to get off your butt and work. But if something happens to somebody in my family where like one of us is becoming hyper rich and other people are no, we're going to sit down and figure out, okay, how can we balance this in such a way that we can stay in a way that allows us to continue to function like a family. And then if you get into a larger context, like my community, like my Christian community, I'm very much like a socialist. Like I don't primarily think when I'm like coaching somebody in my community in their job to try to help them economically, I'm not constantly thinking about the return, right? I want them to own their own stuff privately, but I think we should give to each other very, very generously in that context, because we know each other, and this is part of what's beautiful about the Christian communities. It functions like a large extended family, which is I think more economically consistent with socialism. And then like kind of a more economic system within the Democrats is like, okay, within a little bit larger group, you might want to offer more benefits, right? Private property is important, but you want to offer certain things within that larger context and try to figure out, okay, who in our city is really in need. And then as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, your economic connections between people needs to get less and less, because the relational connection of honor starts to break down at certain sizes of groups,
Yeah.
right? I'm just too distant from you to really know what you need, to really help you properly. And so I don't, and what's really weird is one of the things I do is if you study certain moral or ethical theorists, there's a guy named Peter Singer, for example. He's probably maybe one of the top philosophers of morality in our day. And he's constantly trying to understand why someone in the West, for example, doesn't have the same obligation morally to a starving person in Africa as they would to somebody in their family or somebody in their city. And he basically has demonstrated through sort of these logical thought experiments that you should feel exactly the same level of obligation to a starving person in 20,000 or 10,000 miles away that you do somebody who's 10 feet away. And our intuitions are broken, and we need to basically rewire society in such a way that you feel equal obligations to every other person on the planet. Now, the problem is, again, that is all of that exists within this guilt justice framework, and it doesn't make sense of an honor shame framework where you're primarily not some kind of logical robot who's trying to live out morality in this way. What you are inside of a network of relationships in which you are accumulating lots of obligations from the perspective of honor that you appreciate and want to accumulate more of in order for you to deepen those relationships. And one of my favorite examples of this is in The Godfather. He's running around in this movie doing favors to everyone. And his response to wanting to be paid back, especially if somebody offers him money, he stops them. He's like, do not give me any money. He says, but then he says to them something like, but the day will come when I might ask for you for a favor. and when that day comes, of course, I will expect you to do this. But until that day, this is all relational. And even on that day, I think he's saying, I want you to do it for me. And that day may never come, he always says, because the fact is, I might not need your help. And if this only goes one direction, great. And for most parents to children, it's going to go one way, and that's great. And but the day may come where I have a fire, and then I have a flood. And on that day, I do hope that you understand that, like, in my moment of vulnerability, it's probably, and in one ways, I think what makes this really insidious is that's actually a really beautiful thing that could happen in a family. Imagine the opposite story, where it's like, Dad, I never thought I could ever give you anything. You give me so much. You've poured out like all these blessings on me and our siblings. And it's amazing that through this crazy series of events, you've become really vulnerable. And I actually can help you. Like, that's beautiful. And why wouldn't you want to have that opportunity? But this justice guilt culture, it goes 100% one direction, and doesn't understand honor, it doesn't understand that relational connection. So yeah, there's a lot there. I think that that's stirring up anything else for you, Sid.
Are you following us on Facebook and Instagram yet? Look up @Family Teams to get even more free content and never miss out on event announcements.
It just makes me think also of the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law.
Yeah.
And how the justice and guilt culture makes me think more of the letter of the law and needing to
Yes.
write down all the numbers and like, where do I owe you here? Where do I owe you here? And it is a lot less relational. Whereas if you feel an obligation towards someone because that's what would be honorable and they did something for you, and so now you just, out of gratitude for what they did to you, want to do something back for them, it's a lot less of like a numbers thing. Like if you received a $20 gift, you want to give back a $20 gift. Like it's a lot less. That just makes me think of a lot more just law instead of just repaying someone because you are out of gratitude or because it's the right thing to do or because of how you were treated, like with the parable, the guy in the parable. Like if he was honorable and more listening to the spirit of the law, then he would have forgiven that man his debt because he had also been forgiven. But because there was in the letter of the law an obligation for that man to give him the 1,000, then he was seeking that instead of paying forward the kindness and generosity that he received. So
Yeah.
yeah, that also makes me think of that kind of similar concepts.
Yeah. So good. And for those of you guys listening to this, please understand, I think both justice and guilt and honor and shame, both frameworks are important. They're both a part of the gospel. But I would say that it's really important to think of these as two cultures that are dials, and that the less connected you are to somebody, the more justice and guilt are going to probably predominate the kind of
Yeah.
connection you have with that person. And the closer you are to somebody, the more honor and shame are going to predominate in that relationship or in that connection. And so both exist. There are times where justice actually does play a role within a family. If a crime were committed, for example, and you need to go before court, primarily you need to be doing that from the perspective of justice, right? But I think it's really important to understand that these are two very different frameworks, and we can't just dial one to 100 and the other to 0 and think you're going to have a flourishing multi-generational family, which is why I wanted to bring this up. It's really important to understand both frameworks, and that within your family, cultivate a culture of honor. Like that is so important if you want those generations to really be, and that's what we're commanded to do by God in the 10 Commandments in order for us to live a long life. And basically he's saying, if you think your kids are going to take care of you in the future, it's primarily going to be because you modeled that. You were honoring your own parents. And man, like imagine what these kids in this example are modeling to their children about what'll happen if some horrible tragedy happens to them and their kids say, hey, we don't owe you anything, sue me. Anyway, that's not a great model to show your kids if you want to live a long and healthy life according to Exodus 20 and the 10 Commandments. All right. Thanks, Sid, so much for jumping on this today. This is a good conversation and kind of took up all of our time, but I like this
Yeah.
one. It's important.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.